We will be able to have the deal. And what do you see here?
Can everyone just minimize it? Yeah, click back on the presentation picture.
There we go. Yeah, we'll
You're good?
Yeah, we're good.
Can I still look at
Yes, yes.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for your patience. So this is only our second time ever doing a hybrid event. We never really know what we're doing. So like I said, we have the camera here that picks up noises. So for people who are here in person, if you can just try to keep it down, that way the camera stays focused on our presenter, Lee. So I'm Sarah, by the way. I'm the CURE project coordinator here at Carlo. I have just a couple quick things to go over. So first is just our disclosure of sponsors and also the Women's and Gender Studies certificate program. Minor. There's great minor.
Nothing minor about it.
The people who provide all the money for our grant and things like that. There's no real conflict or anything like that, but so we're a rather large grant, as you can see here. It's through HRSA and then BWET and all sorts of acronyms and letters in there. So just November 17th at 12 o'clock. That is virtual only, as are, I believe, the rest of our events for this year. That'll feature Andrew Klein, who works for the VA Pittsburgh healthcare system, and it's going to be about suicide prevention. For anyone who doesn't already, if you could follow us on Eventbrite, it's you'll kind of always get the updates and everything else from us. I see you taking a picture. Okay. For anyone that wants CEs for tonight, you do have to do two things. So one, on the next slide, you're going to sign in via the survey that's on there. It's just like a quick 3-question thing. And then at the very end of the presentation, you can go ahead and do the QR code. You can click on the thing on the bottom. At the very end of the presentation, you're going to see a slide that looks exactly the same. And that's going to be our post-presentation survey. So if you could fill that out. Everyone fill out that survey because we kind of try to use the feedback and all that. I think that is it for me. So Dr. Ken is going to introduce our speaker.
Well, I'm the luckiest guy in the room because I get to introduce my friend, Dr. Lee Golubieski, who is now an assistant professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Fredonia. Dominion University, his MS in Applied Development Psychology from the University of Pittsburgh, that's where we met, and BS in Psychology from Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. Lee has specialized in developmental psychology and is passionate about teaching and service. Most recently, while teaching at ODU, Lee received the Champion of Diversity Award, which recognizes faculty members who promote and advance the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the classroom and across campus community. Lee's research focuses on minority stress and health management among sexual and gender minority, or SGM, populations. More specifically, his work highlights the impact of stigma, discrimination, and internalized homophobia among SGM college students. Lee plans to continue his research among individuals at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities to raise awareness and reduce mental health disparities for all SGM populations. As I said, I had the great pleasure of working with Dr. Lee before Dr. Lee was Dr. Lee and now is Dr. Ken. Back in our days working at HIT with the great Dr. Tom Akiva, we focused on a project that really celebrates and take place when you share a moment. And you all are so lucky that we get to share a moment with Dr. Lee. And I'm thrilled and excited to learn from you and thrilled to have you back in Oakland.
All right, well, You gotta put me on a pedestal now. I gotta come after that. Goodness gracious. I wish you could hype me up every morning I go to teach. But like you said, my name is Lee. Dr. G works as well. My students have a really hard time with the last name. I still probably don't know how to pronounce my last name appropriately. It's was raised and I became who I was, literally a trans individual right down the street at Pitt. That's kind of where I found my identity. So it really meant a lot. And I had this kind of surreal moment driving back into the city as who I am today. So I'm really honored to be here with you guys today. So today we're going to be covering basically inclusive healthcare and what that means and ways in which you in your field, in your respective profession, may be able to integrate the most inclusive, the most respected and respectable form of healthcare to trans populations. So first we're going to go over trans individuals in the US. And then I'm going to tie it into a couple different background theoretical frameworks. One of them being the gender spectrum, which you may have heard of before, and then the big broad minority stress framework, or that theory from Elon Meyer. We're going to talk about that. Looking at mental health also with that community, knowing I'm sure you're aware that there's a significant mental health disparities in that population, and then the service needs that those individuals may express coming to you as a practitioner or a professional. We're going to look at some barriers, as every good researcher does. What are the barriers to care and how can we overcome them? Looking at the role of the professional, specifically in regards to building rapport and working with a trans individual as a client. And then I have a couple recommendations for practice based on my experiences as a client, also research and being in the field in psychology. We're going to look to finally kind of close on a happy note, looking at social support and community building. Can we take this?
Is it okay?
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Also, the people at home, I can't see or hear you, but I can feel you in my spirit, and hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now with the mic. I'm not used to having one teaching, but usually I shout for you, and our classes are smaller for them, yeah. So, trans people, you've probably heard before, oh, how does this impact me? Or, oh, back in my day, there weren't all these trans people. Well, quite frankly, there were. We just didn't really have the appropriate terminology to recognize it, right? So currently there are about 1.6 million individuals, 0.5 of adults, and 1.4 youth up to age 18 that identify as transgender. And to put that in perspective, that's about the entire population of Hawaii, or 2 times the population of DC. So it does impact people within our country, and the community is rather large, and I'm proud of that, right? So the term transgender is referring to those individuals that their gender identity does not correspond with their sex assigned at birth, as opposed to cisgender populations. And it's an umbrella term. So it does often include the term gender diverse, which is someone whose gender identity does not fit in between the binary of man and woman, or gender nonconforming, which is an individual whose expression of their gender identity is not expressed as either male or female. For the purposes of today and the talk today, I'm going to use that term trans, and I want you to understand that it may or may not include those because there are many that identify as this in addition to trans. So the gender spectrum also looks kind of like that. And there's a lot of different iterations of it. There's some 3D versions of it, but essentially what it's doing is it's telling you that there is a spectrum of gender identity, that no one person necessarily may associate themselves as completely male or completely female, that we are all made up of male and female characteristics. And it's important to consider that, especially also those individuals that may not fit in between any version of that. So knowing essentially that this spectrum exists is a really important kind of framework or theory to go off of if you practice in the field. Also, another one is minority stress framework or theory. As I mentioned, it was derived in about 2003 from Elon Meyer. He looked at minority stress often accumulate for individuals that are sexual minorities. And due to the accumulation of that, he calls it kind of chronic stress or chronic experiences of stigma and discrimination, we're more likely to see an increase in mental health problems and diagnoses. But the problem comes when we start applying it to trans populations, because many trans populations don't really feel like they fit necessarily with other sexual minority groups. For example, the trans experience may be different than the experience of a lesbian individual or a gay individual. And it's hard often to group them together. And we say we don't like to consolidate identities. So from Myers' framework, we've kind of come up with this term of gender minority stress. So that experience, that deals with experiences that are unique to the person's gender identity, right? So maybe you've heard before that may be more or less accepted than trans individuals do, because unfortunately in our society, we have a strong stigma and we kind of want to force people into a binary. We like putting them in boxes. It's human nature to want to categorize things. So it makes sense to want to categorize people. But this framework claims that by doing that, we are essentially increasing those experiences of stigma that a trans person may experience, resulting in more prominent or a stronger likelihood of significant mental health problems and things especially like anxiety, depression, suicidality. So speaking of mental health, right? The DSM, the change from the 4 to the 5 was very significant for this population in particular, because we saw a change from the diagnosis of gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. So gender identity disorder sounds very stigmatizing because it essentially groups gender identity to a disordered belief or a disorder itself. So it was really cool to see that that was kind of recategorized as gender dysphoria, which is the distress resulting from the incongruence of one's birth assigned sex and their gender identity. And as you know, with most classifications of things in the DSM, it has to come with extreme distress, where it takes up many of your thoughts, your beliefs, right? And it interferes with your daily functioning. And as a result, often of that minority stress that we just discussed, trans individuals experience higher levels of homelessness, unemployment, workplace discrimination, substance use, sexual and physical violence, which we've seen exponentially increase in the past couple of years. For example, there were 32 trans individuals that were killed in 2022 alone, which puts the overall total at 302 since the FBI started tracking hate crimes against trans individuals in 2013. It also the #1 targeted population in our country in terms of hate crimes, sexual misconduct, things like that. So that's a strong thing to also be aware of when you're working with this population, is knowing that physical violence is a very real threat. Recent National Transgender Discrimination Survey found that about 40% of individuals expressed mental health issues related to anxiety, depression, and suicidality. And what's even more alarming for me, I'm a kid kind of person, I work in development, so LGBTQIA+ youth, roughly from 31 to 50% have reported suicidal behavior in their lives, and that's as a youth before even reaching age 18. So we see that this population is also highly impacted by the external environment around them, and suicidal ideation in particular is a very, very real thing that you may encounter with this population. So what do trans people want? What do they want, right? What would they seek when they come to you, if you are a practitioner, if you're a social worker, a psychiatrist, psychologist? Typically, we see commonly HRT, hormone replacement therapy, feminizing or masculinizing procedures or surgeries, as it's more commonly called, and then also related to finding a surgeon. It also may be trying to change a gender marker, some legal names or documentation, which every state is different, and there are a million hoops that a trans person has to jump through just to change any of those things. So the documentation itself can be very daunting. Trans individuals may also seek a written recommendation from a therapist that is required for gender-affirming medical intervention like a surgery, which is understandable to the extent of being able to kind of assert or being able to work with a therapist, but it's now kind of considered a gatekeeping process because it can withhold very necessary services for individuals. So again, and the hard part about this too is that a lot of trans clients may come to you seeking a letter and then they'll dip, right? that they will get that letter, they'll get that affirmation, and then suddenly services are ended, right? Or they don't seek services anymore. So again, bridging that disconnect is something that I look to try to do specifically when with outreach with other therapists and psychologists. Speaking of the letter, right? These are mine. I was lucky enough, my therapist Tammy is actually virtually here with us, but I'm very lucky to have an incredible therapist and an incredible PCP and an incredible surgeon that worked together. And it was really, really helpful to me as a trans individual to have them communicate with one another, because I felt like I was telling my story over and over and over again. And it was really hard to just continuously have to explain myself almost from day one, every time I saw a practitioner. So please be aware of that when you provide this letter, that instead of just handing it over, connecting with the person that you are referring them to, right? Connecting with that person, working with them, and really trying to kind of bridge the gap with other healthcare providers, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So we also need to look at some barriers to care, some things that may prevent trans individuals from seeking services with you, or just in general, right? Things that they may experience or they may tell you that they are experiencing. So I like to look at it in two folds. I like to look at it first in a systemic manner. So these are things that all trans individuals and a lot of LGBTQIA+ populations will experience. So obviously we know about the US legislation and the fact that there were 567 bills proposed in 2023, and 86 of those were passed as compared to the 23 that were passed the year before. So in particular, this past year has been, in my opinion, the most traumatic for trans individuals. So those are things, the bans that we see experiencing, I consider those big systemic barriers that often will prevent trans people. Yes, 567 in this past year that were proposed, yes, and then to 86. Yeah, and then there's some other systemic ones such as financial challenges, right, which every human experiences often. And then socioeconomic concerns that may prevent a person from seeking treatment, such as transportation and lack of housing. But what's interesting, right, once we get past the systemic barriers, I really want to draw attention to the individual barriers. So these are barriers that are unique just to trans individuals and to this population. So the number one reason why trans individuals report that they don't seek services, or that they do seek services and they find a strong barrier once they do, is related to lack of access to specific providers. And importantly, right, providers that are culturally competent regarding gender minority stress and trans issues, so they understand things like the documentation that is required, that they understand the legislation that has been passed. Also, that they are trained and experienced with treatment services. Maybe you're sitting here as a provider and you feel overwhelmed or over your head, or you feel like you cannot help this population because you don't feel appropriately trained, or you don't feel like you have the experience because you've never worked with an individual with HRT, or you've never been taught what that is or what that looks like. They also are lacking providers that are familiar with referrals, that know surgeons in the area or that in their area, that know about other resources, that know about the community around them. So we're seeing also these three specific things that trans individuals are reporting time and time again that they're experiencing an issue with when they do seek services. So what can you do, right? We're going to start kind of from the ground up and then look at more external or outside of the walls in which you may practice. Okay, so first of all, building rapport and open communication. They say that first impressions mean a lot. They absolutely do. And I'm sure you've all experienced this way if you've worked with a client one-on-one, but open communication is key. And I think there's kind of this underlying belief that you may offend a trans individual by promoting open communication, because trans individuals are often kind of taught to be closed. We're kind of taught not to disclose, right? Or we're taught that if we do disclose, we're going to experience backlash. So when somebody asks us a question, it seems like trans individuals may unfortunately shut down. And you, as a practitioner, may not want to force that person to shut down, if that makes sense. But I argue from the trans person's perspective that open communication is key. So firstly, looking at language, right? Obviously, avoiding terms that are stigmatizing or that are outdated or that don't apply to our population, like the term transgendered, which is grammatically wrong. Things like tranny, he, she, transvestite, trust me, most of us have been called all of those things before, right? Also finding out the client's preferred name and pronouns from the start and using it from day one, right? Kind of off the bat. I love hearing conversations when people in general conversations will ask that. Like I was just walking by some of my students asking about each other's pronouns and I had a little proud dad moment because it's becoming more common, but it should absolutely be used in practice. Also including gender neutral terms. Instead of saying mother, father, male, female, saying things like partner, parent, people, you all, even yins. I don't really know how that falls in the spectrum, right? But making sure it's more gender neutral. Refraining from engaging in microaggressions, or those, even if they're not purposely, those stigmatizing comments or stereotypical beliefs or assertions that you may make, like asking intrusive questions about a trans person's body or physical attributes. Pretty much all of us have experienced those questions before, and some of us learn to let them roll off our back. That individual, assuming who they date or find attractive, because we know that sexual orientation is not synonymous with gender identity, that a person's identity does not mean that they have one or a certain type of orientation or attraction towards a person. Also making comments regarding passing or their transition. Some trans individuals like hearing that you didn't know they were trans, right? But it can be very harmful to that person. And honestly, making comments about it at all, it should be avoided. And then implementing the gender spectrum mindset, like I just mentioned, right? That there are some people that may be a little bit more pink or a little bit more blue or half pink and half blue. And the cool thing about that, as I was preparing for this talk, is that when you put pink and blue together, what color does it make? Which happens to be the color of your university, right? So if you want to apply that purple framework, please do so, right? Knowing that we're all essentially purple, that no matter how feminine you feel you are, you may have one or two masculine traits that are hiding underneath, right? You may not realize them until you're starting to realize that there may be a masculine person that mindset in mind. Going off of the purple framework, I kind of came up with, I'm a big color-coded acronym. I love that kind of stuff to help learning, right? So I came up with an easier acronym to kind of implement some recommendations, and it's LEAD: learn, examine, ask, and display. So the first one is learn. Learn absolutely everything you can with every opportunity that you can about trans populations. Now it's hard, right? Because often these trainings are still relatively new. Even though it's 2023, they're still quite new to your profession. But APA has a lot of really great sponsored trainings. Obviously, attending this today is one aspect and one way in which I see you guys out here trying to learn, so thank you for that. Attending conferences and conventions and online accrediting training sites, there's a million out there, which I will show you in just a moment. But when a couple different surveys were passed with graduate students that were working on becoming therapists, and they asked them what they did to prepare to work with this population. And the number one thing they said was, I went out on my own and I engaged in self-instruction and exploration. I know that Google isn't the most reliable, right? But there are certain things online, for example, or books. I know when I came out as trans to my mom, who's also virtually attending, the first thing she did was get on Amazon and bought every book that she could about how to parent your trans child. And it made my heart feel real warm, I will say that. Because it showed me that on her own, she was seeking out, what can I do to support this population? What can I do to support my son? Also, peer mentorship. There's a lot of individuals out there that know a lot about this, right? Whether they be trans or not. A lot of gender affirming practitioners, Planned Parenthood has a lot of them that you may be able to network with. Other PCPs or individuals who have engaged in HRT with a client would be a great person to consult. Also, trans individuals themselves. I think that we're afraid, as a cisgender population maybe, to seek out trans individuals and to ask them questions, right? But for some of us, me, for example, I like talking about my experience because I know it's gonna help you help someone else. So first of all, understanding where that person is at. I'm not saying go up to a random trans person with a checklist and ask them boxes, but if you know that that person is willing to share with you, like me or someone else, maybe kind of, picking in their brains a bit. And that can actually help you in your field and your profession as well. As I mentioned some of the workshop, this took me about 5 minutes to find these resources. There are a million out there, and there are a lot of sources that are more or less credible, some of them being obviously APA, the LGBT Life Center, the Trevor Project is one of my absolute favorites. The ACLU, there's a lot of out there that are accredited, and if you have a question about accreditation, I would recommend contacting their board of directors if you have a question about if that training is appropriate for you or your colleagues, and also kind of tracking down the individuals that are promoting those trainings or that put them on also. Most of them are pretty responsive if you did want to hold one of these as well for your school or your practice. The next one is examine. Speaking kind of on to the whole self-instruction thing, examining implicit and personal biases, something that I recommend all people, but especially if you're working with trans individuals. So if you have some personal biases, asking yourself what privileges I have that others don't, or do I interact with people with different lived experiences? I always tell my students in class, I say, if you think you know something, go out and find somebody who thinks the exact opposite. And if at the end of the day, if you sit down at a table with them and you talk to them and you leave that table with the same beliefs, then it means it's what you believe, right? Because too many times we seek out people that are like-minded, that are like us, that affirm our beliefs that we already have. We're not learning or growing in that aspect. So I put examine on here because I think there's a really strong importance in examining yourself, kind of doing a lot of self-internalization and reflection. Also examining the structure of your clinic or your practice, being able to update forms, so that your forms and your documentations include all identities, right? Constantly, every time I fill out a form, right now it's about a 50-50 chance whether they put what your sex is or what your gender is. And othering in the field or having a box that says other is actually considered not the best practice now, right? So we want to have something like please describe, right? Or not listed. And typically giving somebody the freedom to kind of assert their own identity is critical, especially in documentation. Also examining those systemic barriers, things like societal stigma, socioeconomic issues, and encouraging dialogue, right? If something comes up, stigma in that person's life, or if they come to you with an experience that they've had, right, talking about it a little bit further, and also talking about it in a broad manner, talking about the stereotype that underlying experience was founded upon. And seeking alternative care options. If you know that trans individual, telehealth is a beautiful thing, and unfortunately we had to rely on it a little bit more than many people wanted to during COVID, but telehealth and support groups are extremely critical in the trans population, and we'll talk a little bit about that more when we look at community building. But just in terms of a practitioner role, offering telehealth may be a really great way to kind of break that barrier and get that trans person on the same page as you. If they can do it maybe from the comfort of their own home, or if they feel a little bit more safe and secure, using more online resources as well. The next one is ask. You know what happens when they say you assume, right? So making assumptions about trans clients can lead you into sticky situations. I've assumed things with my trans friends, for example, and I make mistakes all the time. I've misgendered people left, right, up, and down, and you would think, how can that possibly happen? It's because I've assumed, unfortunately, right? So one thing you can do is asking the client how they view or define their gender identity. So asking them from the start, right? You know, that kind of intake, that first session is very critical for any client, but especially for trans individuals, because you can establish this from the get-go. You can also ask them what their stance is on their former birth or dead name or their history of youth. So for example, my former name is Leanna. I go by Lee. My middle name is Anderson, which is my mom's maiden name. And when you say Lee Anderson together, it kind of sounds like Leanna. I was named after my grandma Lee, whose name is Leona. So my name was very, very important to me. And I love the fact that I was born and raised as Leanna. Now, there are a lot of trans people that absolutely do not like their former name. They call it their dead name. I call mine my former name because to me, it's not dead. It's still part of who I am. So I don't really, honestly, I don't like the fact that people call Leanna my dead name. And I told my therapist that from the start because she kept calling it my dead name. And I was like, you know, I'm still part, I feel Leanna inside of me still. So asking that or assuming that a person feels a certain stance about their identity or their name can lead you down a road which may already cause some confrontation between you and your client. Also asking them what their service needs and goals are. What brings you here today? What are your overall goals and what are your goals just for today or between this session and next session, right? We know that in your role as a professional, there may be those bigger goals like the yearly 5-10-year goals, but it may also be the what are we going to work on this week? Or what's something you experienced this past week that's troubling you that we can kind of work through together between now and next session? All those questions are incredibly important and helpful for trans individuals. And then asking them questions, right? I think a lot of times you as a practitioner, you want to do everything and that you possibly can for your client, right? And you're maybe worried about offending a trans individual. Well, I'm here to tell you that we've probably heard way worse outside of the walls that we work within you. We've learned to have tough skin. So asking a question for me to clarify with you is the least of our concern. And if anything, I would argue, again, I can only speak on my personal perspective, but I would argue that if you're asking me one of these questions, can you clarify what you mean? I'm unfamiliar about that topic. Can you explain it more? Or do you mind if I research this further? That to me feels great because it shows me that instead of just brushing it under the rug or being worried about how I'm going to respond if you ask me, you're willing to learn alongside with me. And you're willing to take the steps with me instead of either A, leaving me out in the cold, or B, worried about offending me. And if you're worried, you can clarify and say, I don't want to, I want to understand your perspective. Please let me know if I'm saying or doing something that is uncomfortable to you. Following it up with kind of a caveat after that shows me that you're willing to kind of look internally and ask me questions to clarify, and I am more than willing to answer them for you. So again, kind of asking those questions, I think a lot of therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists are a little bit worried about asking them because they're worried about offending us. But I promise you that for most trans individuals, we would rather have you ask because we want to clear the air also, because we know that that's going to be better for us in the long run. Display is a big one as well. Pronouns are kind of all the rage. I love seeing them on like stickers on cups, and my favorite is email signatures. I love seeing pronouns in email signatures. It's like, I don't know why, every time I see that, it really makes me feel like we're making big strides and improvements in the field. So putting it on like a name tag, having pins, for example, which I have for you guys today, using them on your office door, seeing any type of representation is incredibly critical. It means that it's a safe space for trans individuals to seek care, to ask questions, and to be who they are, essentially. Also using themed brochures, books, music, having a pride library was something that my school at ODU that I just came from, and we have a smaller one, but it's in the works in our smaller library at Fredonia. But that's important because it shows trans individuals that there are others like them, that there are others that are published authors, that are musicians, that have done great things, that have gone out and they're working in their communities. All of those things are incredibly important just to show representation. Also, pride flags, posters, stickers, even warm lighting and colors go a long way. I'm sure you know that environment is key, and it can be a small thing that makes a big difference when you're working with a trans individual. It also cultivates an open and accepting environment. One thing too is images of prominent LGBTQIA plus figures. We recently redid our women's and gender equities office at ODU right before I left, and we had kind of the ribbon cutting ceremony. And my favorite part was right when we walked in, the entire wall was a mural of important and prominent figures. And they were people that were from all walks of life. I think sometimes we think of trans people as kind of like these, they have to be really well known and they have to be like a famous athlete or like a singer or like somebody who's like hypothesized out in society who it doesn't exist in our everyday life, right? But what they had is they had community members also on that mural. They had people who were also professors at that school. They had people that were just like you and me, that weren't in the media hyped up, right? That weren't on some big screen, but it shows trans people that they can exist in their life just as a cisgender person can. They don't have to be ostracized. They don't have to be put, under a spotlight, right? Because many of us, we don't necessarily want to stick out. We do, and we feel that we do, but we want to feel included in our community as just someone who's just like you, right? So that was a really important thing for me to see, and I think it's really critical that we can show those examples. So outside of your walls, once we get through, the learning, the examining, once we get through the appraisals, and once we get through the displaying of all of these things, what do we do, right? What do we do outside of our walls? Well, the moderator that I've been looking at consistently in all of my research / mediator, and most recently with my dissertation was social support. And I looked at the comparison between like family social support, friend social support, and sexuality specific social support, or support from other LGBTQIA+ populations. So facilitating social support is one of the more strongest moderators that predicts more positive mental health outcomes for this population. It matters. Social support matters, point blank. It's also important for people with concealable identities. Now I say concealable identities because that's an individual that has an identity that they can hide from the population. But unfortunately, right, it may be a benefit to be able to withhold that information. It comes with a lot of devaluation. It comes with a lot of internalized transphobia or internalized homophobia, right? So we see that, unfortunately, as one of the negative aspects of having a concealable identity. But through social support, through knowing that I am going to be supported by disclosing, makes me more likely to disclose, and that internalization suddenly goes down because we know that if I do disclose, it's going to be accepted, it's going to be understood, and I'm going to be appreciated for doing so. It can also lessen the effects of a lot of different psychological distress resulting from stigma, prejudice, discrimination, and violence. That's from one of the older buffering hypothesis, which is a stress formation theory, which basically argues that when you combat stress with social support, the stress suddenly feels more alleviated. It also can counteract low parental acceptance and rejection, which is the #1 reason, unfortunately, that trans individuals report that they do not experience family support, and we're talking about like biological families or families of origin. Unfortunately, that is a reason why often trans people will not disclose, or why they feel victimized by their own family, why they may be kicked out, why they may be disowned by parents, grandparents, siblings, etc. However, on a positive note, social support from a sexuality-specific support group has been considered the strongest predictor of positive sexual identity development. And I love seeing this specifically with my students. I work almost exclusively with those first-year freshman students. Many of them come from very unaccepting family backgrounds. So college to them is their first experience with a queer group of friends. It's their first experience with like Queer Alliance, right? Or a pride group on campus. And boy, do I love watching them flourish, because it's suddenly that aspect of I'm home here and I have people that just understand me. And even if they don't understand me, even if they have a different identity, like maybe they're a lesbian individual who doesn't understand me as a trans person, they understand what it's like to be a minority, point blank. And there's a lot of community and there's a lot of fostering resilience that will happen in these social support groups. We also look at families of origin versus families of choice. Families of choice are chosen families, one of the terms that we use when we seek out individuals who are other sexual minorities also. And there can be very strong connections that are made there that I would encourage you to kind of draw upon if you are working with a trans individual, or finding those families or social support through families of choice. A lot of them may be through like life centers in the community. They may be on the campus that you work with. Almost every campus I know now has some type of queer group, whether it be in a formal building, whether it be in somebody's house or their backyard. But there are those groups that exist, and I encourage you to find those to be able to point trans individuals in that direction. Also, community building is one aspect. LGBTQIA+ community connectedness. That is one term that we use when we're looking specifically at individuals that are sexual minorities that fall within that acronym, seeking out resilience with one another and building community and kind of fostering that emotional connection. Individuals that are part of this community argue that they used it for sharing concerns, for sharing positive things that happen as well, for asking each other and offering advice. I will tell you that when I came out as trans, my best friend was trans at the time, which really helps me down looking back. They were a few steps ahead of me, and now I love watching. I have a couple younger individuals that are transitioning currently, and they're asking me all these questions about like what happened when they started T, or what do I do when I seek out a surgeon, or what forms do I have to fill out, right? And it's kind of like this generativity within the trans population that we see where we're giving back to younger individuals. So I would encourage you, right, to find, if you find somebody, for example, who is trans, who has gone through their transition or who is experienced or knowledgeable, right, knowing that they may know more than you and putting your trans client within their realm may be very critical, may be very important, right? And many of us, most of us that are trans are more than willing to help others in our community, especially those that may feel a little lost or those that may be experiencing something that we have already experienced. Also taking pride in one's identity. We see that called trans joy a lot of times now. It's kind of this, common socio-cultural term that we've used to describe that joy that we experience in coming out as trans, and that it continues to, we can kind of carry that, right? That trans joy may not exist right at first. And for a lot of clients, right, it kind of seems like it's more of like a trans sentence, so to speak, where they feel sentenced by that identity or where they feel like they have to live a certain way, right? But there's really no way to live as a trans person. And once we kind of realize that, find community and realize that there are a lot of people like us, you kind of tend to see trans individuals flourish. Another one is also virtual communities. So I mentioned before that virtual communities are important with practicing within mental health, but especially for trans individuals because there aren't too many of us. And there are those that are out as trans may not be able to be out in public. So they may be out online or they may be out through social groups, right? One of the most important things that I found was actually a top surgery Facebook group where I've made a lot of friends, and I was actually able to connect with 3 young men who also had their top surgery on the exact same day as me. And I kid you not, it was, if you believe in a higher power, it was some kind of weird thing where we all went in at different hours of the day. So like my friend Tim, he went in first, and then my friend JJ went in, and then I went in, and then Mark was last, in order. And we were so spread out that we were able to actually FaceTime with each other afterwards. And we would do daily updates. Like the first day is always the worst. And you know, if you've ever had surgery, the day after the surgery is like you're ready to just not exist, right? You're not feeling it. We were able to connect with one another all through that Facebook page that unfortunately, as much as I love you guys as practitioners, you could have never provided for us. So encouraging your trans client to seek out those Facebook groups, right? To seek out those social media or those internets or even email chains. I know that sometimes we also have sources of therapeutic groups, right? Like divisions of APA or divisions of our practice, right? Or within our community that we may also be able to reach out to as well. Telehealth and online support groups, as I mentioned, are also critical. That can be one area in which you may see more trans individuals kind of working with one another. I would also encourage you to also find them for the people in their lives, right? So for example, parents often have those support groups. And a lot of parents feel very lost too with how to support their trans child, right? They may either kind of overindulge and try to kind of get their hands like over involved in that trans individual's life, or they may be very hands off because they feel they can't help them or they don't understand their circumstance. So connecting parents of trans individuals with other parents is also very critical, and it will help that trans person down the road. Absolutely. So some of the take-home points. That trans individuals do experience distinct forms of, I want to say, gender-based stigma, right? So the differences between what it's like to be a cisgender person and a trans person, resulting in greater physical and mental health problems. That they do express unique service needs, more specifically those written referrals or recommendations, right? And again, how that can be one way that you can serve them, but also make sure that it is accessible to all trans individuals so that it doesn't really seem as much of a gatekeeping process. Open communication is key, right? Building rapport from the start, asking those questions, asking them about their identity, their names, those questions from the start, and then also continuously updating that. So for example, a trans individual's identity may change over time. We know that identity is fluid, right? So if maybe I started as non-binary, I was there for a hot second, and I was like, nope, I switched quickly into he, him. But those couple months where I was they, them, my therapist kind of got this feeling that I did want to switch into he, him, and continuously asked me. And in a lot of ways, that was kind of what put it in front of me, and that was kind of the realization that I had when somebody came to me about it, right? Almost like she knew me better than I knew myself, which I'm sure you may experience that with some of your clients already. There are many practice recommendations, right, that learn, examine, ask, and display those things that you can all do individually, also that are not necessarily as time consuming or financially straining, that I would encourage you to draw upon. Facilitating social support is critical, especially that sexuality specific social support. Connecting a trans person with other queer people, even if it's just one person, or even if it's a community that's online, is very important, and it can increase their mental health outcomes. It can also increase your work with them, right? You may see them respond more favorably to you when they have other sources of support, right? That you're not their be all end all, which is very, very also lessens the stress on your shoulders as well. Also, community building. It's a tool used to increase social support among trans individuals. It creates that sense of togetherness, promotes positive well-being. The last thing that I read right before I put this presentation together was a qualitative study with a bunch of trans individuals, and one comment stuck out to me is they had trans individuals come to almost like a summer camp where they got to just be around other trans people. And they thought it was gonna be this kind of big therapeutic retreat, and it turned out to just be like a regular summer camp. And the people that put it on thought that they were gonna have these big benchmarkers, and it was really just a big hangout session. But in the responses that they got, those qualitative responses, one of the kids said, you know, when I came here, we're the normal ones. And I don't know why that will always stick with me, is because we're taught by society that being trans is not normal, right? That being trans is not average. And when they're around other trans people, they felt normal. So I want to normalize that experience by showing trans people that there are others like them out there, right? That when they're around, and what is normal anyway, right? That they are around other trans people, that it can be normalized, and suddenly their experiences may be shared by that community, or they may be not as much alone. There are some long references. I could put a million more on there for you, but the biggies, so to speak. And I would also like to thank Ken, thank Sarah, thank you guys for having me here, for the CURE organization, and for being back at Carlo. And the purple thing really fit well, so I appreciate y'all. Whoever decided that was a color for you guys, that means that's cool. And I also want to say, what questions do you have? Because I find out if I ask my students, do you have any questions, they're a little bit more shy. But if I assume they have questions and say, what questions do you have? Suddenly hands go up. So I'll open the floor to questions or comments.
So I'm just going to demonstrate for those that ask a question. If you use the mics in front of you, the people at home can also hear, so we know how to use those. So one question that I have is, I've heard more recent stuff that says a move away from saying preferred pronoun, because preferred is almost taking away the power.
Right.
So have you heard, is there a move towards just saying pronouns versus preferred pronouns?
Yes, so I started using pronouns. I know preferred pronouns is a little bit more outdated. I think it might also be because some people don't have a preference to pronouns. Like, a lot of people are saying use any pronouns, right? So preferred, I understand why there is a little bit of a stigma behind it, but now I'm seeing, especially with non-binary individuals, they're taking all pronouns, right? Or they're taking, you know, any pronouns, or some people would prefer just to use their name. Like, they don't even want to kind of stray away from that. So I think the reason why preferred is still kind of staying on or tacking on is because it tells you that they do have a preference. Like, they don't care or they do care about whatever pronouns you use. But I do understand what you're saying, that overall asking just what your pronouns are is a safe bet as well. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Okay, I work in a 2nd through 8th grade school.
Okay.
I've got a ton of trans kiddos. We're like a special education school. With that, I think comes like a lot of, there kids who are like, you know, differently minded. And I know there's like a correlation between like trans people in the autistic community, because like viewing gender when you have kind of these like larger views of like self. I know a lot of autistic people who are non-binary. Anyway, my question is, when the kind of the social situation right now with kids and transness is so fraught, do you have recommendations about like tiptoeing that line, dealing with parents. Like, I know, I always ask my kids, like, what pronouns should I use to refer to you? What pronouns should I use to refer to you to your parents? Names, same thing.
Yeah,
So like navigating that, do you have any like
sure.
recommendations?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I taught K through 4 for I almost didn't go back and get my PhD, and I would have had to redo my entire bachelor's, but I was in education for a while. My favorite was second grade. I was in second grade.
They're my favorite.
I don't know why, it's like this.
Oh, they're the best. I was just on the phone with my mom like yesterday being like, second grade is still where it's at.
I know, and I would go back in a heartbeat, but I miss the psych stuff. I can't teach like psychological theories to second graders, right? But that's a very good point. I mean, most research says that an individual starts to develop their gender identity at age 4. So it makes sense that children are expressing that. And the cool thing I love about kids is that they just kind of get it. Like they don't really, you tell somebody their gender, or you tell somebody that they're really not a male or a female, and they're just kind of like, okay, and they continue playing, right? Because they're not quite yet socialized. They don't have the world, so to speak, kind of raining down on them. I would argue though that I would find more of a challenge with the parent aspect, as you mentioned, and gender identity. And I think that it's important to allow students within your classroom to use the pronouns that they prefer, that they accept. And also one thing that I found that was important is embedding it in my curriculum kind of helps the other students get it. So like there are a ton of books out there about, a person's identity and about I am who I am. And there is a book that I'll see me after this. It's called Parenting Beyond Pink and Blue, which is kind of where I pulled the tagline from. Not I have to steal completely. But it talks about how you can parent when your child may be experiencing a different gender identity. They're not cisgender. So I would recommend, if your parents are concerned about that or want to know more, there's a ton of books also for parents that I would point them into. Unfortunately, you can't change the mindset of a parent that just doesn't understand or that doesn't want to understand. So protecting yourself in that situation as an educator, keep that in mind also. So I would say first, allowing the students, and also having those conversations between students, also displaying your pronouns, and then the parent aspect, if the parent wants to know more, giving them those resources. If they don't, knowing that you can only work with them within that environment and doing your best and hoping that down the road one day, when they are able to make those decisions outside of their parent, that they feel better or more inclined to do that. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, there's no answers to those questions. That's a gray area that nobody knows an answer to, but I appreciate you working in that environment and bringing in something that seems so complex to such a younger sample. So
yeah,
that's awesome.
It is like amazing, like how little they can be, and they
Right.
really just know, and they accept each other. Like the classrooms are so like.
That's why I went into developmental psychology, because I think there's such a benefit to that time of your life, and if we could all essentially recreate that, how much less conflict there would be in the world, honestly. So thank you for bringing that perspective. That's awesome. Yes.
So I'm curious, of course, I'm a deaf individual here. I connect to the deaf community well, and it's a small community, so I'm familiar with that. So I know we have trans people. Their community is also small. I may have trans friends, but I might wonder how they can get support if there's not available for deaf-friendly resources, deaf access, ASL access. I can provide resources, but most of them are for hearing people. You'll have to request an interpreter. You'll have to do other things. So I'm trying to think about how to make recommendations without that barrier included.
Excellent question. I am unfortunately not as knowledgeable with the deaf community. I think that,
of course, then that's fine.
I think that it would be really important to find resources that may extend online, like I said. Also, understanding that there's intersectionality. So like I love working with intersectionality theory. When I look at intersectionality theory, I look at it more with like racial, ethnic overlap into sexual minorities. However, I realize that like the hearing impaired or the deaf community intersected with sexual and gender minorities is also a very prominent thing. So if you're able on your own to research intersectionality in regards to the deaf community, I would recommend that. I would also
Somewhere to start so that I know where to research and how to find that support for my deaf clients. I would always love to better serve my community. so.
Sure. Yeah, honestly, I could do some research on my own because I don't know as much about the deaf community. But I know that there are tons of resources specifically for practitioners that work with just hearing impaired or deaf people. But I'm not sure about, the overlap into the SGM community.
Yeah, so that's part of the fun part of the deaf community. There's always overlap.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out, what all I can find resources to match.
I will, can we exchange contacts and I'll help and we can talk about it maybe later or after
Yeah,
that?
sure.
Okay, because I'd have to do
Oh,
my
yeah,
own research.
that would be great.
That's so far out of my wheelhouse, but I really I would be very interested in finding out more also.
Yes, of course, same.
Those starting their career in the field, what would be a good and smart way to connect with gender affirming medical practitioners?
Sure, there are lists typically, I know it varies by state, but being in Virginia, I had access to a list of providers that were gender affirming, that were specifically trans friendly. There's also was a list of surgeons, and most practitioners that are a part of any type of network within that state will be able to give you those resources. So again, I know a little bit more about Virginia because that's where I sought my most of my services. But typically there are forums and there are networks, and there's a lot of online resources. It's kind of like essentially when you search like Highmark for a provider, like you want to know if your insurance is covered. There's like lists and databases. So a lot of it is, like I said, based on state. But Planned Parenthood is a great place to start because they typically have like the basis of providers. And then from there, they can give you, they can give you different locations depending on where you're at. I know it's obviously they're way more in bigger cities. Like being in Fredonia, most of my friends in that area had to travel to Buffalo. So it's typically in bigger cities, unfortunately, but there's almost always a database per state that I could share if you want, or that most like Planned Parenthood resources would have like external links to.
UPMC has a gender clinic as well for adolescents and
What
young
is that? What's
UPMC.
Yeah,
Gender.
UPMC, yeah, there's that also. I know there's one in Erie, like Hammett. The Hammett Hospital has a really great gender affirming, and I think it's based out of the women's section of the hospital and stuff. So it's sometimes often embedded within other areas too. That's kind of what we see more commonly. Yeah, so it's hard to kind of tease it out. Yes.
This is kind of a two-part question.
Sure.
So, for some context, I meet with clients monthly. There's paperwork that has to be signed. I do have a trans individual who, unfortunately, he has to sign his dead name for legal purposes.
Right.
So, first part of the question is there anything I can do to kind of make that a little easier on him? Because I can tell it does take a toll on him each month that I have to have him sign this. And then the second part is there anything I can do to kind of advocate with the people who require this paperwork to then also be able to accept the name that he goes by now?
Sure. I will say, unfortunately, I know that you want to help him with the name, but I've changed my name for years now, and probably half of my mail is still Leanna. So please know that, like, if the name is tripping you or the client up, that unfortunately there are so many more external things where they're going to get their dead name or their former name. So don't try to take that all on yourself. Take a little sigh of relief, first of all, because I can see it stressing you out. Unfortunately, there's no workaround around the name thing. There's documentation that I'm assuming that if you were to go to those people and ask for that person to sign their preferred name, I think that they might, unfortunately, depending on I don't know how important that documentation is. Sometimes they have like a secondary line. I've seen some documents where they will say, here's your name, and then also like, was there a former name, or like some documentations even require me to tell you my former name. Like especially if it's like related to an ID card or something, or like for work, I just did my HR stuff and I had to put all my former name stuff. So it still comes up, unfortunately, down the road. I would advocate that if you're talking to that company or corporation or whoever is in charge of making those documents, to maybe advocate for a secondary line so that he can sign both at least. That might be a little bit more affirming, just so that he can say, hey, this is what I have to sign, but this is who I am. So sometimes that secondary line is really helpful. And I've seen that a lot on a lot of forms, so maybe asking that would probably be my recommendation.
Yeah.
And that would probably help him as well.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yes,
Hello.
hi.
So you're talking about purple people and that there is masculine, feminine, and everybody. And I'm just wondering what psychological theories or theorists you have to back that up?
Sure.
Just because, I'm a woman veteran. One of the problems that veterans have was transitioning. They studied the men about regaining a civilian identity, but they have not I found a UK study about it, about women trying to regain a feminine identity after the military and about how much trouble they get into on that journey.
Right. So I know a little bit about reintegration. I was actually in a military and a youth resiliency lab at ODU, so I understand how incredibly hard the reintegration process can be. I will say that some of the research Robert Stoller was the individual who coined the term gender identity back in like 1960. He was kind of the underlying theorist who started the gender spectrum movement. However, there are so many reiterations of it. There are so many theorists and researchers that have come after the fact. I would also point towards the Kinsey scale, and Kinsey's research also is very, very credible in terms of looking at the basis of the gender spectrum. But like I said, there are a lot of people that have come along and taken it and looking now at like 3D, looking at the overlap of like queer and gender fluid, which is another terminology that means like the constant flux of gender identity. So there's a lot of overlapping theories, and the gender spectrum theory isn't really a theory in and of itself. It's kind of a framework or a model that we use that's based from very older theories, like even minority stress, but mainly like the Kinsey stuff and Stoller's research. So I would encourage you to look up his stuff if you want to learn more. And then in terms of the reintegration question, I think it's very difficult because trans people in general are constantly, if you identify as a trans male or a trans woman, you are constantly trying to fight the battle of, but you took that identity. And like, for example, me as a trans man, there are a lot of cisgender men that think I don't deserve that title because I chose it, right? Or they feel threatened because that was something they had by birth that I am now just deciding is my identity. And there's constantly that backlash. And I think that when you're talking about with the veteran thing, they're experiencing that because they're having to transition into civilian life, and the civilian does not understand the experience that they had just as a veteran. So it's hard because that population that is being discriminatory will never understand the role of what a veteran is. Me not being a veteran, I will never understand your role as a veteran, and I can try to, and I can make claims or comments about you, but I can't understand your perspective. Same thing with the trans population. So I think what your question is how, are you asking me how to improve that, or?
It's just that the women veterans are seen as too direct, too masculine. And so a lot of times they end up pendulum swinging into hyperfemininity. And so there's a lot of gendered things that haven't really fully been explored because the military is a hyper-masculine environment.
Oh, absolutely. And the same thing with, I think, trans individuals often are trying to constantly assert their transness. One thing I always say is that we have different roles. Like you look at role string theory and psychology and how sometimes we feel pushed to assert one of the roles over the others, right? So my thing was always like, my name is Lee and I am trans, but I'm not trans Lee. Like trans is part of my identity. I don't identify myself as, I don't walk up to somebody and say, hey, I'm trans, or hey, I'm a veteran, right? Because that's just part of your identity. I think with masculine and feminine is people tend to kind of, like you said, overcompensate, or when they come out, there's a lot of research behind when an individual comes out, they will jump into that identity. So for example, like a lot of sexual activity, as soon as they come out with a partner that they identify with that orientation. So like a lot of people will kind of jump into that, almost kind of feel like they're making up for that lost time that they weren't that identity. Or like a veteran, for example, making up for that lost time where they couldn't be feminine because they had to be a man in a man-dominated field. So I would honestly argue just encouraging them to find other supportive individuals that are both female, that are both service members, but that also realize that they have masculine attributes, but that their feminine attributes can coincide with those, and finding individuals while they're reintegrating that are also feminine and talking about their struggles, right? Talking about the experiences that they have. I know the VA isn't the most reliable in terms of mental health services, unfortunately. So maybe finding something outside of that, that's more community-based might help them. But yeah, like you said, it's kind of like that need to kind of like assert yourself. Once you take an identity or once you feel pulled into an identity, sometimes overacting into that can be very challenging, especially right after integration, like right after, returning from service. But thank you for bringing up that perspective too.
No, thank you.
I love how we have like the kids and then we have like deaf individuals, service, background. That's really, like you can see intersectionality is, more present than ever.
Okay, there's another question from the chat. Do you see any difference between the services offered to LGBTIA+ clients who have Medicaid versus private insurance?
Yes, I think that with Medicaid, there is a benefit because it's more universal versus private insurance. You have a really hard time finding, my insurance, I selected my insurance because I knew it would be covered, my surgery would be covered. So that's kind of the key, is looking at, I know personally, Highmark, Blue Cross, and what's the other one? There's like the three of the major insurance companies have been notoriously accepting of individuals who seek HRT or gender affirming surgeries. So I would encourage you, using that EOB and looking for your benefits, and also that time, that open enrollment period was actually where I made the jump from somebody who wouldn't have allowed me to get whatever surgery or services I needed into the newer insurance. But private insurance can be very tricky because typically they don't, I would go with more of a national organization for insurances, because that I know of tend to be a little bit more accepting, because the private ones, they may be, but then you might not be able to find a therapist that is accepting of that. So it's hard to find ones that overlap with both the therapy aspect and then also the surgery and medical aspect. So that's why I've always recommended people go with the goats, so to speak, of the insurance world, unfortunately. Yeah. I hope that answered it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm wondering, is using, say, the market, do you do the research before you go to the market, or does the market help you find what you need?
So I went to a specific individual that was he worked on the marketplace, and I contacted him and I pretty much said, here are the things I'm looking for. Can you help me search through things? And he was really helpful. So if you are able to find somebody first and then tell them the main things that you need, just like I know, my parents, for example, they need certain prescriptions. So their reasoning to select an insurance company was because they could get those prescriptions at a much lower cost. So I would say prioritizing, if that is something that you're seeking as a trans individual, or if your clients are seeking, tell them to go to the health insurance with that first. If that is something, and typically that's the most expensive thing that you're going to encounter, like a surgery or lifetime medications related to HRT, going with that first, searching for that, and then selecting your plan, versus having the plan and then trying to back into that and have to kind of, backlog. Yeah. And I'm not a huge insurance person. I just know what worked for me when I saw it. Let's go working backwards, actually. Yeah.
I'm in nurse practitioner school here, and I've worked as a nurse for 3 years now. And I've worked with a few individuals who are trans or haven't come out yet. And we started clinicals this semester, so I haven't seen anyone yet who identifies as trans. But how do you talk to people who have a uterus or who have testicles, or how do you talk to them about, you need to get a pap smear, you need to get a mammogram, all that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, that can be embarrassing. I think every time I go to the doctor, they ask me about that. They ask me about pap smear, and I've kind of become used to it at this point. And I think at some point your role this is aside, this is not research based, but at some point your role as a nurse or a doctor or in the medical profession is to keep that person safe, right? So that means essentially throwing that awkward question out there doing it, structuring it in a, like I usually they say the caveat before, they're like, I have to ask this, and then they ask you, right? So saying something like that maybe might kind of help them brace for the question you're gonna ask. And then maybe also asking them like, you know, making sure that when you do ask that question, it's just with them versus like maybe if there are parents in the room, right? Or if there's their spouse or partners in the room, that's typically something that they may or may not want to disclose when other people. So I would just say you have to ask it, unfortunately. And it may be hard for you to ask, but again, your role is to keep them safe, to keep them healthy, but just doing it in the most culturally sensitive way, that when it's just you and them, and knowing that like you can move on immediately after that, maybe not like on a day, for example, when they already had a lot of other things, like don't ask me that on the very first day when I come in for my first shot of tea. And then like, that's already a kind of a hard situation itself. So doing it maybe on those follow-up appointments with a series of other questions where it's kind of just routine might help your trans client kind of get past that one question, knowing that like, it's just a routine at this point. That's something that's what helped me. But yeah, good question. I like that you're asking that because you're examining their perspective. You just showed me that you're examining their perspective, which is great. So thank you. Yes.
So that made me think of another question, because I'm a social work major right now. So obviously I work with the deaf community, and if I meet a deaf person, how can I help that client prepare for questions that might happen when they go into a medical setting? Can I, as a social worker, help them know, oh, they might ask you about the following things, and that would allow the client to process that beforehand?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's really no way, I think, to prepare a trans individual for those awkward questions. But like I said kind of earlier in the presentation, is that we as trans people have heard a lot, right? And I think like practitioners are really afraid of offending trans individuals, but like honestly, I'm more offended when I turn on the news than see the stuff that's happening with my community. Like I think that like the questions that we get in a medical situation or with a therapist in a therapeutic, relationship, those questions may be hard, but those are things that we understand that are kind of part of your world, our world, your role, versus like the individuals that are making these comments that are, off the hip, that are not in a sanctioned relationship or in a more like safe environment. So I would say just prepare them that things are going to be challenging, probably, especially when you first come out as trans, or when you first start. I know the first like year or so was the hardest for me because everything was new and changing and challenging. It was exciting, but it was scared the heck out of me. I bawled my eyes out after my first HRT appointment in a positive way, and now I'm like, it's everyday life. So just knowing that it's going to be, pun intended, a transition while they transition into that role. And just telling them that there are going to be things that are going to be unsettling for them, and allowing them to process that with you, I think was probably the most beneficial thing. But good question. Yes.
So I have a question about perhaps a section of intersectionality that we don't talk much about, but
Sure.
When professional and personal, there's intersections there. So we're talking very professionally about how we can tailor our practices or conduct ourselves to like be respectful and open and create those safe environments. Mm-hmm. So do you have any advice? And I mean like quick advice, not sitting people down and trying to give them a lecture, but when you're in your personal spaces where there might not be people who are working to do this work, or the news comes on and you hear inappropriate comments from the people in your personal life, what can you say that's not like, I'm going to sit down and give you a lecture now and bring you into my professional world, but what can you say that's like still respectful of your relationship with those people, but also recognizes that that's not the way that you conduct yourself and those aren't the feelings that you have?
Yeah.
I don't know if my question makes sense, but
that's you're basically explaining my everyday life.
I think about this a lot.
No.
So that's tips. I love
that you think about that. But yeah, it's nice because we work in a field, like I feel more safe at work than I ever will. Like living in psychology at a university, being young, being 2023, every day of my life, I think if I was born in like the 50s, I wouldn't have survived. I would have had a very, very difficult time. I wouldn't be able to be me. So that's one thing that I'm like so thankful about. But like, we hear those conversations, and I think that we encounter it, and it's funny because as a trans person, oftentimes that person has no idea that I'm trans, or that they're, even like you, for example, like not being a trans person, but that you care a lot about that population. So if somebody was to make that comment, you might put your foot down, right? And I understand your hesitancy because you also don't have the patience or the time, or like, should you waste your breath, essentially, not to be rude, but should you waste your breath trying to describe this to this person who may never get it, right? We see that all the time, for example, even in like families. Like I have so many family members that I could try to explain who I am to them and they're just not gonna get it. So one thing that I always tell my trans friends is know when to cut your ties. And you have to know that person. If that is a person that maybe through time and through, explaining things little by little, they might be able to get it. I like to use like little, like the Hansel and Gretel, like leaving breadcrumbs, right? So that maybe one day I can kind of lead them to this be all end all state of understanding, which may not be the case. But I find that leading by example is one of my best things as a trans person. So like you maybe leading by example as an ally is a great thing. Allyship is massive, right? Outside of your profession. I've encountered it a lot, like at the gym. There'll be guys in the locker room, and the locker room can be a very, very scary place when you're a trans person. And I've kind of learned to laugh at it. Like I have literally people next to me that are making comments and I'm right next to them and they have no idea, or maybe they find out down the road and then they're like, oh crap, I said this last month. And I've had people come to me literally a year later. I had a friend from undergrad make a comment and say, hey, I said something really offensive. I actually didn't remember the comment they said, to be honest. I said something really offensive about gay people and I didn't even know when you came out as trans, and I'm sorry, and they'll apologize. So I think part of it is leading by example, knowing that person well enough to know if you can have those conversations. And then when something comes up in media, when something comes up, kind of pointing that out and pointing out your perspective on it in a way in which you're not, like necessarily influencing them, like saying something, well, like, yeah, I think that's really interesting, or I think that's really great that that person did that, or I noticed this. Because the easiest way that I have found to potentially change a person or to make them open their eyes is never by fighting fire with fire and confronting them by saying, well, I don't think this. As soon as you tell someone they're wrong, their ears will close, literally close. So maybe just saying, rephrasing things like, oh, it's interesting that that's your perspective, but I know that this, or, like I had this experience, can sometimes be the best techniques that I find. But I love that you're thinking about it in a personal way also.
Yeah. So my go-to eye roll is okay.
The RBF,
Right
the rest of the chase doesn't work.
Leave it at that is an okay breadcrumb to start with.
I mean.
I'm just like, go a little deeper. I mean, I'm serious because like sometimes, like you said, you're in a space where you could put forth all your energy and you're not gonna get anywhere, right?
Right.
But I also don't want to be in that space and just act like it's okay.
Right.
I want to leave it at like, I'm just gonna ignore it and act like it's okay.
I think there's kind of like this unconscious line that like when a person is expressing explicit stereotype or discriminatory comments, especially when it's super derogatory or when you think they may put that person in harm's way, or they may do something against that population, I think then absolutely put your foot down. Like that's a time.
More like a microaggression
Yeah.
amongst the dinner table, or you know what I mean, something like that.
Yeah, I think honestly, there's so many contextual things that matter more, or that I guess you would have to examine in that situation. But like knowing if you think that if you have the time, if you have the space, if you have the capacity. I also caution you guys, especially because I know that this room in particular cares about trans people, I would hope, is that remember that they're probably not thinking about it as much as you are. Like that comment that they made, you'll probably carry it the next day or the day after. So my biggest thing too is also protect yourself and your heart, and ask yourself, if bringing that up would bring you peace, then do it. If bringing it up is going to cause you more harm or more stress, or they may get angry and that relationship may be severed and you want to keep that relationship, then maybe not. I also think that you have to think about yourself in that role. As much as you want to care or make comments or something, if that microaggression was severe enough to where it's causing you a lot of distress, make that comment, say something back. But if it's a microaggression that like maybe you realize that like that's not, like it was an underhand comment, there was no like specific foundation belief behind that, maybe let it go. But again, like, as time goes on, if those things accumulate, that might be a sign that they have that underlying belief that you could potentially work around or with or against. So, yeah, of course. Again, like I said, I could give you my answers and they may be different than somebody else's answers. But I appreciate that question and your caring concern for sure.
I have another one.
Sure.
Oh, no, go ahead. You sure? Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay. To Dr. Stock's point, first of all, I completely understand. So I have a family member who I love dearly, but always makes derogatory comments. I have a younger sibling who hears those comments, and so I make it a point to separate. Like, when I'm with this person, I can't fight that battle with you every day. But when I'm with my sibling, I'm explaining that that's one person's perspective. You don't have to live that way. You don't have to think that way. You may hear it, but you don't have to internalize that. That's just disrespect, and we don't like that. But we love that individual, so you can separate it. But it's very, very hard. Very, very hard. So that is like a learned thing. I feel like it is continuous. So my question is, when I think about my own experiences with wonderful trans folks, there seems to be sometimes, not always, you ask questions or you're curious. And as a person with a disability, I don't always like to answer questions about anything I have going on. Not to equate the two, but when it's something so personal to you, I don't like to always answer questions. Right. And so sometimes in that time frame or in that mindset, you don't want to answer questions, right? Right. But what I found sometimes is that there comes an aggression sometimes with those situations. Absolutely. And honestly, in my opinion, rightfully so. You're not entitled to my feelings. You're not entitled to hear them. You're not entitled to anything that I have going on. But how do you kind of help them see that it is not to be intrusive or it's not to be disrespectful, but to learn more, even if you're not in that mindset currently, but I still want to know you. I still want to understand you just so we can be better as individuals and have a relationship. Like, what are your recommendations for that?
Well, first of all, the way that you asked that question, is this on still? The way that you asked that question shows me that if you were to ask that to your full trans folk, they probably love you already. So first of all, know that how you come off, we're human, we're trans people, we get it. We can kind of pick up if you're gonna ask it if it was a random stranger asking me versus like my bestie, yeah. I'm gonna tell my bestie everything, right? So there's a difference. The relationship itself matters a lot in the context of those questions. But I understand the aggression. Because I understand trans people, they already assume that people are making assumptions about them. So when somebody asks them the question, they think that there's a backhanded reason why, right? Instead of just wanting to know. I had a gentleman, I had never talked to him in my life, but I'd seen him at the gym like a million times, came up to me in the locker room, pointed right at my scars and said, "What are those?" And I've had a lot of little kids do that, but for a grown man, a big jack, like dude benches like 5 of me, okay? In the gym, coming to me, pointing at my scars, asking me, and then he was like, crap, and he realized, and he said, listen, bro, and the exact words, "I just want to know. I just want to know." And that was the only thing he said. And I took it as like this might be his only interaction with a trans person ever. So for me, I'm going to stop and explain, right? I could have gotten mad. I could have gotten angry because the way in which he did it was kind of awkward and uncomfortable, right? Other people in the gym heard him. But I would argue that framing that question matters. Also using those caveats like, "Hey, listen, I'm just curious and it'll help me understand better." People are much more likely to answer you, right? If you tell them that you're coming from a place in which you want to understand, right? That is kind of like the golden gate, so to speak, to kind of hopefully open up a more safe dialogue, right? But also tell them, say something like, "You do not have to answer this question. You can tell me no." Or if you don't want to talk about this ever, or maybe I caught you on a bad day, or maybe you don't really want to disclose, saying that before you even ask the question gives me an out so that if I don't want to answer it, I don't have to, right? Those little small caveats in conversation can carry that conversation and can make or break it. So I would say, first of all, you're incredible, and I'm guessing that your trans friends probably think you're awesome and are going to talk about it anyway. I'm just saying, like, we know we know who the safe people are in the room. It's like we have this like radar, we like, oh, I can talk to you, I can talk to you. We know those people. So feel reassured in that. But also, like I said, asking them, saying, I just want to know you better. I just want to understand, or literally saying, listen, I'm cis, right? I don't get it. So can you help me understand this? We're likely to respond. And then saying something like, you don't have to answer, or like, if you don't want to disclose, or if you don't know, right? Also asking when there are other trans or people around, or other queer people around too may be helpful, because sometimes my trans buddy that I hang out with all the time will make a comment and I'll piggyback off of him. And when we're both answering questions together, that open freeway dialogue can be also very helpful too. Yeah, of course. Great question though. Yes.
So you talk about trans joy, but I was thinking, what if you had a client who invested a lot into transitioning and they didn't feel the trans joy? Like, how do you comfort somebody like that?
Sure.
What do you say?
Sure. I think people ask me that question, like when I got top surgery, they kind of thought I was like done. They were like, oh, so you're better now. Like if you've ever gone to treatment, or if you've ever been inpatient in a facility and then you leave, people think you're better. There's no end to your gender identity. There's no like, oh, you're not trans and then you are, or you're more or less trans on parts of your journey. There are guys that have been on T for 2 months and have a full beard, and I've tried for 3 years to get it facial hair and I can't get it. And it drives me nuts. And that trans joy is gone when I think of the other trans men that have full beards and that look maybe more or less trans than I do. So what the problem is trans people, once you start that route, you start to compare with other trans people. Women, men do it, trans men do it also. I mean, humans compare, but especially when you're on a medical transition, you kind of can start to compare. So I would argue that the trans joy is going to come and go. It's like happiness, right? They say, people ask me what I want. I never say happiness. I say peace, because happiness is a fleeting emotion. Peace is long lasting, right? So trans joy is fleeting. Trans joy is going to come and go. Some days when I turn on the news and I see what's going on, trans joy is under the table and non-existent that day, right? Seeing a buddy, the moment that I looked in the mirror when I got my drains and all that out, trans joy, right? So I would argue that trans joy is going to come and go, just like happiness comes and goes. The key is finding peace within your transition. And the key is looking long-term. Looking at myself 10 years ago, Baby Lee had no idea that Baby Lee was trans. Baby Lee had no idea. I was going through photo albums, looking at pictures, and I was like, oh, you little kid, wait till you see what's in store for you, right? So I would encourage knowing that trans joy is fleeting, and knowing that longitudinally, if you can look back and be proud on your journey, that in and of itself is more important than those daily things that come and go. Yeah, that's one thing I resonate on. Great question though.
Yes, I have another question. Sorry, I have so many questions today. So, thinking about trans joy again. I know one person who transitioned several years ago. They wanted to transition, knew that their identity didn't match, and then they changed back to their birth identity after realizing that, you know, they understood involvement in the trans community, but didn't really feel like it fit anymore. So they rejected that label. They no longer felt connected to that. They sort of went back and forth. How can I help a person who might experience that journey of transition and then realize that that no longer fit with them and still be supportive?
Sure. One thing I will say that a lot of right-wing conservative transphobic individuals tend is they'll pull up one study from like the past 50 years and says, this person regretted their surgery and now they feel absolutely awful, which is like 0.01% of the population regrets their transition, especially if it's a medically induced or like a surgery specifically. I will say though that there is the fact that gender identity is fluid. And I have a lot of friends that were trans that now take they, them, because they're kind of feeling more pulled towards the middle end of that spectrum, right? They're kind of feeling, and I think that as we continue to progress, they're saying that gender norms are becoming less and less more pronounced in our society. So we're gonna see that happen more and more. So telling your friend or explaining to your friend that like that's not uncommon for individuals to suddenly feel more pulled towards one end of the spectrum or to feel dead in the center, right? Like there's a really funny TikTok that I just sent my friend last night because they're non-binary, and it says like, you know, I'm too man to be a woman, but I'm too woman to be a man. And that's kind of essentially what it is that it, like I said, it's some days, like some days you may wake up, you may feel very masculine. Some days you may wake up, feel more feminine, or maybe you have physical characteristics versus your socio-emotional and your psychological characteristics. Like we all probably know somebody who looks very masked. It's a big, maybe potentially big beard, lumberjack type figure who's a big teddy bear. Or the woman who looks very feminine, who is a powerhouse CEO, who is called too manly, or who's called too powering or too dominant, right? So telling that person that by changing their identity, all they're doing is just changing who their experiences in that time period. They're changing their presentation within that one contextual time period, and knowing that down the road it's going to change, and also showing them that there are a lot of people also that aren't pulled to one or the other, that don't fit that binary. I think that when I always say that non-binary people have it harder, honestly, a lot of times than trans people do, because at least I'm saying I'm in the man box, and people are like, okay, I can do that, I can do he, him, I can do she, her, but I can't do that they, them thing, right? I can't do that, when they actually do in grammar, like they use it all the time, right? But telling them that they are really, those are the courageous ones, I think, is the non-binary, the they, them individuals, because they're the ones that say, screw you, binaries. It could be easier to pick one to consolidate or to affirm what society wants me to say. But introducing them to that perspective and showing them that there are a lot of individuals that fall well in the middle as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So I know we're out of time for those that are home, and I think we just so much appreciate your time, your authenticity, and just sharing your experience. And this has been amazing. What I'm guessing you'll stick around if there's folks in the room that have questions, they want to come up to you. Just will mention for those at home, the CEU and evaluations are in the chat right now, so you're welcome to begin filling those out, and it provides you the procedures for turning those in and getting credits. We ask anyone for feedback. We love it. Thank you again, Dr. Lee, and thank you for those that attended today.
Yes, thank you. I just want to again say thank you. When you reached out to me, it had been a hot minute since we spoke. So a lot of changes have happened literally with both of us. So it's good to be back here. I will be here for questions. And I also have these, speaking of displaying, feel free to take some of these with you and my card. I'm willing to exchange contact information with everyone who's here or who wants more information. But again, thank you for letting me share my story and some research, and for your input as well. I learned probably just as much as you did today. So thank you again.
Hey, whichever one.
Yeah, it was like forward or
So